Imagine this. December 1937, the height of one of the most brutal massacres in human history, and the only thing standing between 250,000 Chinese civilians and certain death is a Nazi flag. Not wielded by a soldier, not hung by a regime enforcer, but draped across makeshift shelters by a German businessman who wore a swastika armband like a shield against hell itself. His name was John Rabe, and for 6 weeks he transformed a university campus in Nanking into what historians would later call the Nanking Safety Zone, a 2.6 square mile island of desperate hope in an ocean of unspeakable violence. But here's the question that will haunt you by the end of this story. How does a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party, a man who believed in Hitler's vision for Germany, become the savior of hundreds of thousands of people that his own allies considered subhuman? And why was his story buried for over 50 years, erased from both Western and Chinese history books, as if the world couldn't handle the moral complexity of a good man wearing the WWII symbol in human history? Before we dive into the blood-soaked streets of Nanking, you need to understand something. John Rabe wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was supposed to be selling electrical equipment. Born in Hamburg in 1882, Rabe had spent nearly 3 decades in China working for Siemens, the German industrial giant. By 1937, he was the head of the company's Nanking office, living comfortably in a large house with his Chinese staff, respected by the local community, fluent in Mandarin, and deeply integrated into the city's social fabric. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1934, not out of fanatical ideology, but because it was good for business. In the world of German expatriates working for major corporations, party membership was practically a requirement, a networking tool, a way to stay connected to the homeland. Rabe believed in German strength, in order, in discipline, but he had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that his loyalty to that symbol would soon be tested in ways that would redefine what it meant to be human. Nanking in 1937 was a city holding its breath. The capital of nationalist China, home to over 1 million souls, it sat directly in the path of the Imperial Japanese Army's brutal advance through the country. Since July, the Japanese had been waging a merciless campaign, and the stories filtering into Nanking were nightmares made real. Entire villages burned, women violated, prisoners executed en masse. The Chinese nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, knew the city couldn't hold. By early December, the order came down: evacuate. The government fled upriver to Wuhan, the military scattered, and the infrastructure of power simply dissolved. What remained were hundreds of thousands of civilians, trapped, defenseless, and staring down the barrel of an approaching army that had already demonstrated its capacity for atrocity. The world watched, but no one intervened. The League of Nations issued statements, diplomats expressed concern, but no troops came, no rescue was mounted. Nanking was alone. Most foreigners fled. Missionaries, diplomats, journalists, they all received evacuation orders from their governments. Get out while you can. But a small group of Westerners, 22 in total, made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. They stayed. Among them were American missionaries like Minnie Vautrin, doctors like Robert Wilson, and businessmen like John Rabe. Together, they formed the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, a desperate gamble to create a neutral area where civilians could take refuge. They had no weapons, no army, no real authority. All they had were their foreign passports, their moral conviction, and in Rabe's case, something utterly unexpected, a Nazi party badge and a swastika flag that, in the twisted logic of 1937 geopolitics, might actually mean something to the Japanese. The Japanese army encircled Nanking on December 9th. The bombing had already begun days earlier, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble and ash. Inside the city, panic spread like wildfire. Families abandoned their homes, clutching whatever they could carry, flooding toward the safety zone. Rabe opened the gates of his compound, the Siemens property, and watched as thousands poured in. They slept in his garden, in his hallways, under tarps stretched between trees. He had no plan, no strategy, just an instinct that somehow being German, being a Nazi, might buy him credibility with Japan's Axis ally. It was a desperate, absurd hope. But it was all he had. On December 13th, 1937, the Japanese army broke through the city gates. What followed over the next 6 weeks would become known as the Rape of Nanking, one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. But in the center of that darkness, beneath swastika flags fluttering in the winter wind, John Rabe was about to do the impossible. The fall of Nanking wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter disguised as a military operation. When Japanese troops poured through the shattered gates on December 13th, they didn't find an enemy army waiting for them. They found chaos. Chinese soldiers, abandoned by their commanders, were stripping off their uniforms and desperately trying to blend into the civilian population. Some threw their weapons into the river. Others buried their military identification in the dirt and wrapped themselves in stolen clothing, hoping to disappear. But the Japanese weren't interested in distinguishing combatants from civilians. To them, every Chinese man of military age was a potential threat, and the orders from their commanders were clear: eliminate resistance, terrorize the population, and break the spirit of China once and for all. Within hours, the killing began. Soldiers went door to door, dragging men into the streets. Mass executions were carried out along the Yangtze River, where thousands were lined up, machine-gunned, and pushed into the water. The river ran red for days. John Rabe watched the horror unfold from the windows of his compound, powerless to stop the tide of violence sweeping through the city. But he refused to look away. Every morning, he ventured out into the streets of the safety zone, his swastika armband prominently displayed on his left arm, his Nazi party badge pinned to his chest. It was a grotesque irony that wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a German representing a regime that preached racial superiority and violent conquest, walking among the victims of another regime doing exactly the same thing. But the armband worked. Japanese soldiers, trained to respect their Axis ally, hesitated when they saw it. Some saluted, others simply backed away. Rabe exploited that hesitation ruthlessly. He positioned himself between soldiers and civilians, shouting in broken Japanese and gesturing wildly at the swastika. He wasn't bluffing with confidence. He was bluffing with sheer audacity, betting his life that the political alliance between Berlin and Tokyo held more weight than a single officer's bloodlust. Inside the safety zone, the situation was deteriorating by the hour. What had been designed to hold 50,000 refugees was now crammed with over 250,000 terrified people. They packed every available space: schools, university buildings, churches, warehouses, open courtyards. Families huddled together under makeshift shelters constructed from bamboo poles and torn fabric. There was no running water. Sanitation collapsed within days. Disease spread quickly through the overcrowded camps. Food was scarce, rationed down to handfuls of rice per person per day. Children cried from hunger. The elderly collapsed from exhaustion. And yet, despite the misery, despite the impossible conditions, the people stayed. Because outside the boundaries of the safety zone, marked by crude flags and handwritten signs, the nightmare was exponentially worse. Women were being dragged from their homes and gang-raped in the streets. Entire families were burned alive in their houses. The Japanese soldiers treated Nanking like a hunting ground, and its people like prey. Rabe worked around the clock. He documented everything. Every atrocity, every violation, every act of brutality he witnessed went into his diary. He wrote letters to the Japanese embassy, to military commanders, to anyone who might listen. He filed formal complaints about soldiers breaking into the safety zone, assaulting women, executing men. Most of his letters were ignored. Some were met with polite apologies and empty promises, but Rabe didn't stop. He understood that his voice, his German identity, gave him a sliver of leverage that the Chinese victims didn't have. He used it relentlessly. When Japanese soldiers climbed over the walls of his compound searching for women, Rabe confronted them personally, shouting, shaming, physically blocking their path. When they demanded to inspect the refugees for hidden soldiers, Rabe negotiated, delayed, and distracted them until the men could be hidden or moved. He was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and he knew one wrong move would get him killed. But the worst part, the part that gnawed at Rabe every single night, was knowing that no matter what he did, it would never be enough. He could save the people inside his walls, but he couldn't save the city. Beyond the safety zone, Nanking was being systematically destroyed. Conservative estimates suggest that over 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers were murdered during the massacre. Tens of thousands of women were raped, entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash, and the world remained silent. No international intervention came, no rescue force arrived. John Rabe, a Nazi businessman armed with nothing but a flag and a diary, was Nanking's only hope, and he was running out of time. By late December, the safety zone had become a city within a city, a fragile bubble of relative protection surrounded by absolute carnage. Rabe and the other members of the International Committee had divided the zone into sectors, each overseen by a different volunteer. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, ran Ginling Women's College, which had become a sanctuary for over 10,000 women and children. Robert Wilson, the only surgeon who stayed behind, operated out of a makeshift hospital with dwindling medical supplies, performing amputations and emergency surgeries under candlelight. But it was Rabe who became the public face of the resistance, the man who stood at the gates every day arguing with Japanese officers, filing complaints and using his German credentials like a weapon. He understood something crucial. The Japanese military command was obsessed with maintaining international legitimacy, especially with Germany. They couldn't afford to openly antagonize a Nazi party member without risking diplomatic fallout. Rabe weaponized that fear, pushing boundaries, testing limits, and gambling that his swastika would continue to shield him from the violence consuming everyone else around him. But the Japanese soldiers on the ground didn't always respect the political niceties their commanders cared about. Despite the official recognition of the safety zone by the Japanese embassy, troops routinely violated its boundaries. They broke down doors searching for young women to abduct. They dragged men out for execution under the pretense of rooting out hidden soldiers. They looted whatever food supplies the committee had managed to stockpile. Rabe responded by becoming insufferable. He followed soldiers around with a camera, photographing their faces, threatening to report them to their superiors. He wrote down badge numbers and unit designations. He marched into military headquarters and demanded meetings with commanding officers, waving his Nazi credentials in their faces. It was theater, performance art designed to intimidate and shame. And shockingly, it often worked. Japanese officers, confronted by this furious German civilian armed with nothing but paperwork and audacity, would sometimes back down, order their men to retreat, issue apologies. Not because they cared about the Chinese victims, but because they cared about appearances. The real battle Rabe fought wasn't against soldiers. It was against time and resources. Feeding over 250,000 people required a logistical miracle that simply didn't exist. The committee scoured the city for rice, beans, anything edible. They negotiated with Japanese supply officers to purchase food at inflated prices. They rationed everything down to starvation levels, calculating how to stretch every grain of rice for one more day. Rabe emptied his own savings to buy supplies. He sold his personal belongings. He begged, borrowed, and bartered for every scrap of food that entered the zone. Meanwhile, the sanitation crisis grew worse. Makeshift latrines overflowed. Cholera broke out. Dysentery spread through the camps. People died not from violence but from disease and malnutrition. Rabe walked through the camps every night, stepping over sleeping bodies packed so tightly there was barely room to walk, and wondered how much longer they could possibly hold out before the entire system collapsed under its own weight. What kept him going, what kept all the committee members going, was the knowledge that abandoning the zone meant condemning hundreds of thousands to certain death. They had become the only barrier between the refugees and annihilation. Rabe knew the limits of his protection. He knew that Japanese soldiers were still committing atrocities inside the zone when he wasn't looking. He knew women were being abducted from the camps at night. He knew men were being executed in hidden corners. But he also knew that without the safety zone, without the facade of international oversight, the massacre would be total and absolute. So he kept pushing. He kept documenting. He kept writing letters that went unanswered and filing complaints that were ignored. He kept wearing that swastika armband, that symbol of hatred, and turning it into a shield for the powerless. By early January 1938, The worst of the violence had begun to subside, not because the Japanese had grown merciful, but because there were simply fewer victims left to kill. The city outside the safety zone had been picked clean. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Houses burned, streets littered with corpses. The Japanese army began to shift its focus toward consolidating control and establishing a puppet government. The frenzied bloodlust of the first weeks gave way to a cold bureaucratic occupation. But the danger wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. Now the question became, how long could Rabe and the committee maintain the safety zone before the Japanese decided it was no longer politically convenient to tolerate it? The transformation of Nanking from a city under siege to a city under occupation brought new horrors, quieter but no less devastating. The Japanese established the Nanking Self-Government Committee, a puppet administration designed to give the illusion of Chinese governance while maintaining total military control. They began registering civilians, issuing identification papers, and demanding that refugees leave the safety zone and return to their homes. But there were no homes to return to. Entire districts had been burned to the ground. The houses that remained standing had been looted, stripped of everything valuable, down to the wooden beams and door frames. And worse, the registration process itself was a trap. Men of military age were being pulled aside during registration, accused of being former soldiers and executed on the spot. Rabe and the committee fought against the forced evacuations, arguing that the refugees had nowhere safe to go. But the Japanese were losing patience. The safety zone had served its purpose as a temporary measure, a way to contain the chaos. Now it was becoming an embarrassment, a visible reminder of the atrocities that had occurred. Rabe's position was becoming increasingly precarious. His employer, Siemens, had been pressuring him to leave China for weeks. Company executives in Berlin were nervous about the negative publicity surrounding the massacre and wanted their employees out of the spotlight. The German embassy in Nanking, which had evacuated before the fall of the city, was now returning and sending clear signals that Rabe's freelance diplomacy was no longer welcome. Ambassador Oskar Trautmann, while privately sympathetic to Rabe's efforts, made it clear that Germany's official policy was neutrality in the Sino-Japanese conflict. Berlin had no interest in antagonizing Tokyo over the treatment of Chinese civilians. Rabe was told to stop filing complaints, stop writing letters, and stop interfering with Japanese military operations. But Rabe ignored the orders. He continued documenting atrocities in his diary, now over 200 pages long, filled with eyewitness accounts, photographs, and detailed descriptions of executions, rapes, and destruction. He knew this evidence might be the only record that survived. Inside the safety zone, life had settled into a grim routine. The initial terror had faded, replaced by exhaustion and resignation. Refugees had organized themselves into makeshift communities, electing representatives, sharing resources, and establishing informal rules to maintain order. Children attended makeshift schools where volunteer teachers held classes in mathematics and Chinese literature, desperate attempts to preserve some sense of normalcy. Women formed groups to protect each other, sleeping in shifts, watching for Japanese soldiers who still prowled the zone at night. The committee distributed rice twice daily, long lines of people waiting hours for their meager rations. Rabe walked among them constantly, a tall German figure in a dark coat and swastika armband, someone who had become both protector and symbol. The refugees called him the living Buddha of Nanking, a title that made him deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't a saint. He was just a man who couldn't bring himself to leave. But Rabe's greatest challenge wasn't managing the refugees or negotiating with the Japanese. It was confronting the moral paradox of his own identity. He was receiving letters from Germany, from Nazi party officials, congratulating him on his humanitarian work and praising his representation of German values abroad. The propaganda ministry in Berlin saw an opportunity. Here was a Nazi party member demonstrating Aryan superiority through compassionate leadership, protecting the weak, bringing order to chaos. They wanted to use his story. Rabe found the letters nauseating. He was witnessing firsthand what totalitarian brutality looked like, what happened when an army was given permission to dehumanize an entire population. The parallels to Nazi ideology were impossible to ignore. Yet he still wore the armband. He still invoked his party membership. He still used the swastika as a shield. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart, but he buried it, because acknowledging the contradiction meant questioning everything, and he didn't have time for existential crises. People were still dying. By late January 1938, Siemens issued an ultimatum: return to Germany immediately or face termination. Rabe stalled as long as he could, but the pressure became unbearable. The German embassy revoked his diplomatic courtesies. His financial resources were depleted, and the committee, while devastated by the prospect of losing him, recognized that his presence was becoming a liability. The Japanese military command had made it clear that the safety zone would be dismantled whether Rabe stayed or not. On February 22, 1938, after 71 days of holding the line against hell itself, John Rabe boarded a ship and left Nanking. As the city disappeared behind him, he carried nothing but his diary and the crushing knowledge that he was leaving 250,000 people to an uncertain fate. Rabe returned to Germany in April 1938, expecting recognition, perhaps even gratitude for his service representing German interests abroad. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. He arrived in Berlin carrying his diary, hundreds of photographs, and a collection of eyewitness testimonies documenting the Nanking massacre in excruciating detail. He believed naively that the German government would be horrified by what their Japanese allies had done. He requested meetings with foreign ministry officials to present his evidence. He wrote letters to high-ranking Nazi party members describing the atrocities. He even prepared a lecture series complete with slides and photographs, intending to inform the German public about the true nature of the war in China. What Rabe didn't understand was that Berlin already knew. They knew and they didn't care. Germany's alliance with Japan was too strategically valuable to risk over the suffering of Chinese civilians. Worse, Rabe's documentation was actively inconvenient, a diplomatic embarrassment that threatened to undermine carefully cultivated relations with Tokyo. The Gestapo came for him in the summer of 1938. They confiscated his diary, his photographs, all his documentation. They interrogated him for hours, demanding to know why he had compiled evidence against Germany's ally, why he had exceeded his authority, why he thought it was appropriate for a private citizen to conduct foreign policy. Rabe tried to explain that he had acted to protect innocent lives, that he had represented German humanitarian values, that he had done nothing wrong. The Gestapo didn't care about his explanations. They ordered him to cease all public speaking about Nanking, to destroy any remaining copies of his materials, and to never discuss the massacre again under threat of arrest. His lecture tour was cancelled. His photographs were seized. His diary disappeared into Gestapo archives. Rabe was effectively silenced, his story buried by the very government he had served. He returned to his small apartment in Berlin, unemployed, broke and broken. Siemens had terminated his contract. His pension was minimal. He had spent his personal savings feeding refugees in Nanking and now had nothing left. Meanwhile, back in Nanking, the safety zone was being systematically dismantled. The Japanese forced the remaining refugees to disperse, tearing down the shelters, reclaiming the university buildings, and erasing all physical evidence that the zone had ever existed. Minnie Vautrin continued her work protecting women at Ginling College for another year before the psychological toll became unbearable. She would eventually take her own life in 1941, unable to escape the memories of what she had witnessed. Robert Wilson left China shortly after Rabe, carrying his own scars. The other committee members scattered, some returning to their home countries, others moving to different parts of China. The International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone was dissolved. Its records were packed into crates and shipped to various archives, where they would remain largely forgotten for decades. The story of the good Nazi of Nanking disappeared from history, too complicated, too inconvenient, too morally ambiguous for anyone to know how to process. John Rabe lived in obscurity in Berlin throughout World War II. He witnessed the bombing of his own city, the destruction of his neighborhood, the collapse of the Nazi regime he had once believed in. When the Allies occupied Germany in 1945, Rabe was briefly arrested because of his Nazi party membership. He was interrogated by Soviet and British authorities, classified as a Nazi collaborator, and denied employment and ration cards. He tried to explain his work in Nanking, but he had no documentation to prove it. The Gestapo had taken everything. His family survived on charity and black market food. In 1946, facing starvation, Rabe wrote a desperate letter to the mayor of Nanking, asking if anyone remembered what he had done, if anyone could verify his story. The letter somehow found its way to the Chinese nationalist government, now relocated to Nanjing after the war. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Survivors of the Nanking Massacre, refugees who had sheltered in Rabe's compound, former committee members, they all came forward with testimonies. The Chinese government sent money, food packages, and official letters of gratitude. They verified his story, confirmed his heroism, and lobbied the Allied authorities to remove the restrictions against him. For the first time since returning to Germany, Rabe's story was validated. But the validation came too late. He was 65 years old in failing health, traumatized by everything he had witnessed in both China and Germany. On January 10, 1950, John Rabe died of a stroke in Berlin, still largely unknown outside a small circle of Nanking survivors. His grave was unmarked. His story remained buried in classified archives. For nearly 40 years, John Rabe's story remained locked away, a historical footnote that neither China nor Germany wanted to confront. The Chinese Communist government, which came to power in 1949, had complicated feelings about the Nanking Massacre itself. Acknowledging the full scale of the atrocity meant admitting how completely the nationalist forces had failed to protect the capital. The narrative didn't fit neatly into communist propaganda about peasant resistance and revolutionary heroism, and highlighting a Nazi as the savior of Chinese civilians created ideological problems that were easier to ignore than explain. Meanwhile, in West Germany, the post-war period was focused on rebuilding national identity and distancing the country from Nazi atrocities. The story of a good Nazi was an oxymoron that challenged the comfortable narrative of clear moral lines. East Germany had no interest in celebrating anyone connected to the Nazi Party. So Rabe's diary remained sealed in East German archives, his photographs scattered across various collections, his story fragmented and inaccessible to researchers and historians. The breakthrough came in 1996, almost 50 years after Rabe's death. His granddaughter, Ursula Reinhardt, discovered portions of his diary hidden in her family's belongings. She had known her grandfather had worked in China, but the full extent of his actions had never been discussed. As she read through the pages, she realized she was holding a primary source document of immense historical importance. Around the same time, the original diary that the Gestapo had confiscated somehow survived the war and was rediscovered in former East German state archives after reunification. When researchers finally gained access, they found over 2,000 pages of meticulous daily entries, photographs, maps, and correspondence, documenting the Nanking Massacre from the perspective of a Western eyewitness. The diary was published in Germany and China, translated into multiple languages, and suddenly John Rabe's story exploded into public consciousness. Historians scrambled to verify the accounts. Survivors, now in their 80s and 90s, came forward to confirm the details. The good Nazi of Nanking was no longer a rumor or a legend, he was documented fact. The publication of the diary forced an uncomfortable reckoning with historical complexity. Rabe's story didn't fit into simple categories of good and evil. He was a Nazi party member who saved hundreds of thousands of lives. He wore a swastika armband while protecting victims of genocide. He believed in Hitler's vision for Germany, while witnessing firsthand the logical conclusion of totalitarian dehumanization. Modern scholars struggled with how to frame him. Was he a hero? Absolutely. Was he complicit in a monstrous regime? Also, yes. The two truths existed simultaneously, and neither cancelled the other out. Rabe's story became a case study in the dangers of moral absolutes, a reminder that history is messier than we want it to be, that people contain multitudes, and that sometimes the person who saves you is wearing the symbol of your oppressor. It was deeply uncomfortable, and that discomfort was precisely why the story had been buried for so long. In China, the rediscovery of Rabe's story coincided with a broader effort to document and memorialize the Nanking Massacre. For decades, the event had been underreported in Western histories of World War II, overshadowed by the European theater and the Holocaust. But Chinese historians and activists were determined to ensure the atrocities were remembered. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall was established, incorporating Rabe's testimony as a crucial piece of evidence. His former residence in Nanjing was converted into a museum dedicated to his life and work. The Chinese government officially honored him as a hero of the Chinese people, a designation that would have seemed impossible during the Cold War era. Survivors who had sheltered in his compound visited the museum, now elderly, tears streaming down their faces as they pointed to photographs and said, "That was him. That was the man who saved us." Their testimonies validated everything Rabe had written in his diary. In Germany, the response was more conflicted. Some praised Rabe as an example of individual moral courage, proof that even within totalitarian systems, people could choose differently. Others argued that celebrating a Nazi, even one who did heroic things, was dangerous and inappropriate. The debate revealed deep tensions about how Germany should remember its past, how to acknowledge complexity without diminishing accountability, how to honor individual acts of goodness without rehabilitating the regime those individuals served. Rabe's grave, unmarked for decades, was finally given a proper headstone in 1997. The inscription was simple: John Rabe, the good German of Nanking. Even in death, the contradiction remained. He was forever both, a Nazi and a savior, a party member and a humanitarian, a man who history tried to forget because remembering him forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. To truly understand the magnitude of what John Rabe accomplished, you need to grasp what he was up against during those 71 days in Nanking. This wasn't a situation where he negotiated with reasonable people who occasionally made mistakes. He was facing an army that had been systematically indoctrinated to view Chinese people as less than human, an occupying force operating under explicit orders to terrorize the population into submission. Japanese military doctrine at the time emphasized total war, the complete destruction of enemy morale through overwhelming violence. Soldiers were told that showing mercy was weakness, that the Chinese were racially inferior, that brutality was not only acceptable but expected. When Rabe positioned himself between armed soldiers and their intended victims, he wasn't appealing to their better nature. He was exploiting a narrow window of political calculation, betting everything on the idea that the Japanese High Command cared more about their alliance with Germany than about the lives of individual Chinese civilians. It was the thinnest possible leverage, and it should never have worked. But it did work again and again through a combination of audacity, theatrics, and sheer stubborn refusal to back down. There are dozens of documented incidents where Rabe physically intervened to stop atrocities in progress. One account describes him running into his garden where Japanese soldiers were assaulting Chinese women, shouting and waving his swastika armband, refusing to move until the soldiers left. Another entry in his diary recounts how he discovered soldiers setting fire to a refugee shelter, and he stood in front of the building, arms spread, daring them to burn him alive with the civilians inside. The soldiers backed down. In yet another incident, Japanese troops demanded to search his compound for hidden Chinese soldiers, threatening to execute any military-age men they found. Rabe agreed to the search, but insisted on accompanying the soldiers personally, directing them away from areas where men were hiding, loudly voicing his authority as a German official, creating enough confusion and delay that many potential victims escaped through back exits. He was improvising constantly, reading situations, adjusting tactics, gambling his life on split-second decisions. What made Rabe's intervention even more remarkable was that he had no illusions about his own limitations. His diary is filled with anguished entries acknowledging that he couldn't save everyone, that atrocities were happening beyond his reach, that his protection extended only as far as his physical presence. He wrote about lying awake at night listening to gunfire in the distance, knowing that people were dying while he slept. He documented his own failures alongside his successes, the times he arrived too late, the women who were abducted despite his protests, the men who were executed before he could intervene. The psychological toll was enormous. He developed chronic insomnia, lost significant weight, and showed signs of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Yet every morning he got up and went back into the streets, knowing that his presence might mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people that day. The swastika itself became a bizarre form of currency in this hellish economy of survival. Rabe distributed makeshift Nazi flags to refugee shelters, instructing the occupants to hang them prominently. Japanese soldiers, seeing the flags, would often bypass those buildings, assuming they were under German protection. It was insane, using the symbol of one genocidal regime to protect victims of another, but it worked often enough to matter. Rabe even gave his personal Nazi party badge to a Chinese family, telling them to show it if soldiers came to their home. They survived. Other refugees painted crude swastikas on their doors and windows. The symbol that would become synonymous with the Holocaust, with the murder of 6 million Jews, was simultaneously being used in Nanking as a shield for 250,000 Chinese civilians. The historical irony is almost unbearable, a reminder that symbols mean different things in different contexts, that desperation creates strange alliances, and that survival sometimes requires embracing contradictions. By mid-January 1938, Rabe had become such an effective obstacle to Japanese operations that military commanders began actively trying to undermine his authority. They sent letters to the German embassy complaining about his interference. They spread rumors that he was harboring Chinese soldiers. They threatened to revoke recognition of the safety zone. But Rabe had one advantage they couldn't easily overcome. He was absolutely, genuinely willing to die for the people he was protecting. Japanese officers could sense it. This wasn't a diplomat playing games or a businessman protecting investments. This was a fanatic, someone who had decided that this hill was worth dying on, and that kind of conviction is terrifying even to armed soldiers. They didn't know how to process a Nazi who cared more about Chinese refugees than about his own safety. So they hesitated, delayed, negotiated, and in those precious hours and days, thousands more people survived. The true climax of Rabe's story didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded across dozens of micro-battles, each one a desperate negotiation between death and survival. One of the most harrowing incidents occurred on January 6, 1938, nearly a month into the occupation. A group of Japanese soldiers broke into the Supreme Court building, which had been converted into a refugee shelter housing over 5,000 people, mostly women and children. The soldiers were conducting what they called a security sweep, but everyone knew what that meant. They were looking for women. Rabe received word of the intrusion and sprinted to the building, his heart pounding, knowing that every second of delay meant more victims. When he arrived, he found soldiers dragging women out of the building, loading them onto trucks. Rabe didn't hesitate. He stepped directly in front of the lead truck, planted his feet, and refused to move. The soldiers yelled at him to step aside. He yelled back in broken Japanese, pointing at his armband, invoking diplomatic immunity he didn't actually have, threatening to report them to their commanding officer. It was pure bluff, backed by nothing but his willingness to be run over. The standoff lasted nearly an hour. Finally, an officer arrived, assessed the situation, and ordered the soldiers to release the women and leave. Rabe had won, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely write about it in his diary that night. These confrontations took a cumulative psychological toll that Rabe's diary reveals in heartbreaking detail. In early entries, his writing is measured, analytical, almost clinical in its documentation of atrocities. But as the weeks progressed, the tone shifted. He began expressing rage, despair, and bitter sarcasm. He wrote about wanting to strangle Japanese officers with his bare hands. He fantasized about having an army division under his command so he could fight back properly. He questioned his own faith, wondering how God could allow such suffering. In one particularly raw entry from late January, he wrote about watching a young girl, no more than 12 years old, being carried back to the safety zone after being gang-raped by Japanese soldiers. She was bleeding, unconscious, barely alive. Rabe sat with her family as she died hours later, unable to do anything but bear witness. He wrote that night that he felt like he was drowning in blood, that the weight of all the suffering he couldn't prevent was crushing him, that he didn't know how much longer he could continue functioning. But the next morning, he was back at the gates, armband on, confronting soldiers, filing complaints, refusing to surrender. The most significant test of Rabe's strategy came when the Japanese military government demanded the complete dissolution of the safety zone. By early February, the occupation authorities had decided the zone was no longer necessary and was actively hindering their efforts to establish control over the city. They issued an order. All refugees must register with the new government, receive identification papers, and return to their homes within 2 weeks. The International Committee protested vehemently. Rabe wrote letters to every Japanese authority he could identify, arguing that forced evacuation would result in mass casualties. He pointed out that homes didn't exist anymore, that registration was being used as a pretext for executions, that the refugees would be defenseless outside the zone's protection. The Japanese responded with bureaucratic indifference. The order stood. Rabe realized he was out of leverage. The swastika had bought time, but time was running out. He couldn't protect people indefinitely, and the Japanese knew it. In those final 2 weeks before his departure, Rabe shifted his focus from immediate intervention to long-term documentation. He became obsessed with creating a complete record of the massacre, knowing that his testimony might be the only evidence that survived. He interviewed hundreds of survivors, recording their stories in meticulous detail. He collected photographs not just of destruction, but of individuals, faces, names, specific victims whose stories might otherwise be lost. He created maps showing where mass executions had occurred, which buildings had been burned, where bodies had been dumped. He compiled lists of atrocities witnessed by committee members, cross-referencing dates, locations, and Japanese military units involved. His diary entries from this period are exhaustive, sometimes running 10 or 15 pages for a single day, as if he was trying to capture every detail before memory faded. Rabe understood that he was creating testimony for a trial that might never happen, evidence for justice that might never come, but he documented everything anyway because it was the only power he had left. On February 22, 1938, Rabe's final day in Nanking, thousands of refugees gathered outside his compound to say goodbye. They had pooled their meager resources to buy him gifts, simple things, a scroll with calligraphy thanking him, a silk banner signed by hundreds of people, small tokens they could barely afford. Rabe stood before them, this tall German man in his dark coat, and for the first time in 71 days he broke down. He wept openly, apologizing for leaving, promising to tell the world what had happened, begging them to forgive him for not being able to save them all. The refugees thanked him. They called him their living Buddha, their protector, their savior. And then he left, carrying his diary, knowing that the real battle, the battle for historical memory, was only beginning. The aftermath of Rabe's departure revealed the true fragility of the protection he had provided. Within weeks of his leaving, the safety zone was forcibly disbanded. Japanese authorities bulldozed the refugee shelters, evicted families from the university buildings, and scattered the remaining population back into the ruins of Nanking. The committee members who stayed behind tried to maintain some level of oversight, but without Rabe's German credentials and relentless confrontational energy, they had significantly less leverage. Minnie Vautrin continued sheltering women at Ginling College, but she was operating on borrowed time, constantly harassed by Japanese soldiers who no longer feared diplomatic consequences. The rapes continued. The executions continued. The difference was that now there was no one with the political capital to intervene effectively. The refugees who had survived the initial massacre now faced a different kind of nightmare, living under permanent occupation, subject to arbitrary violence, with no hope of protection or escape. Many of the women who had sheltered in the safety zone were eventually forced into sexual slavery in Japanese military brothels. Men were conscripted into labor battalions. Families were separated. The survival that Rabe had brought them was temporary, a brief reprieve before the machinery of occupation ground them down again. Back in Germany, Rabe's silencing by the Gestapo meant that his documentation of the Nanking massacre never reached the international audience it deserved during the war. The photographs and diary entries that could have provided crucial evidence of Japanese war crimes were locked away, inaccessible to prosecutors, journalists, or historians. When the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo in 1946 to prosecute Japanese war criminals, the Nanking Massacre was included in the charges, but the evidence presented was fragmentary and incomplete. Rabe's comprehensive documentation, which would have been devastating testimony, was still sealed in Soviet-controlled archives in East Germany. Some committee members, like Minnie Vautrin and Robert Wilson, provided written testimony, but they were dead or unavailable for cross-examination by the time the trials began. As a result, the full scope of the Nanking atrocities was never adequately presented at the Tokyo trials, and many of the officers responsible for the massacre received lighter sentences or avoided prosecution entirely. The historical record was incomplete, the justice inadequate, precisely because Rabe's voice had been suppressed. The geopolitical dynamics of the Cold War further complicated efforts to memorialize the Nanking Massacre. In the 1950s and 60s, the United States was actively rebuilding Japan as a democratic ally against Communist China, which meant downplaying Japanese wartime atrocities that might undermine that alliance. American textbooks barely mentioned Nanking. Hollywood films about World War II focused exclusively on the European theater. Meanwhile, Communist China under Mao Zedong was focused on internal political campaigns, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, massive upheavals that left little room for careful historical documentation of events that had occurred under nationalist rule. The massacre became a political football, invoked when convenient, ignored when inconvenient, but never fully examined with the scholarly rigor it deserved. Survivors aged and died, their testimonies unrecorded, their stories lost. The physical evidence was destroyed or built over as Nanjing was reconstructed. An entire generation grew up in both China and the West with only the vaguest awareness that the Nanking Massacre had even happened. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that serious historical research into the massacre resumed. Chinese scholars, working with newly accessible archives, began compiling comprehensive accounts. Iris Chang's best-selling book, The Rape of Nanking, published in 1997, brought the massacre to mainstream Western attention for the first time. And critically, the rediscovery of Rabe's diary provided the detailed, day-by-day Western eyewitness account that had been missing for decades. Suddenly, historians had a complete picture. Chinese survivors' testimonies, Japanese military records captured after the war, and Rabe's meticulous German documentation all corroborating each other. The historical denial that had been possible when evidence was scattered and incomplete became untenable. The numbers were staggering and undeniable. Over 300,000 killed, tens of thousands raped, a city systematically destroyed. And at the center of the documentation was this impossible figure, a Nazi who had risked everything to save people his own government considered expendable. The legal and diplomatic ramifications continue to this day. Japan's relationship with China remains strained partly because of disputes over how the Nanking Massacre is remembered and taught. Japanese nationalist politicians periodically visit the Yasukuni Shrine, where convicted war criminals are honored, sparking outrage in China. Chinese government officials use the massacre as a rallying point for anti-Japanese sentiment. History textbooks in both countries present dramatically different versions of what happened. And Rabe's story sits uncomfortably in the middle of these disputes, a piece of evidence that everyone acknowledges, but that supports multiple competing narratives depending on which aspects you emphasize. He was a Nazi who saved Chinese lives. He documented Japanese atrocities that his own government tried to suppress. He represents both the best of individual moral courage and the worst of institutional complicity. His story refuses to be simplified, and that's precisely why it matters. So why does John Rabe's story matter today, nearly 90 years after the Nanking Massacre? Because it destroys our comfortable narratives about good and evil, about heroes and villains, about who gets to be remembered and who gets erased. We want history to be simple. We want the Nazis to be pure evil, the Allies to be pure good, the victims to be blameless, and the perpetrators to be monsters. Rabe shatters that simplicity. He forces us to confront the reality that a card-carrying Nazi, a man who believed in Hitler, who wore the swastika proudly, could simultaneously be responsible for saving 250,000 lives. That contradiction is unbearable for many people, which is exactly why his story was buried for 50 years. It's easier to forget the good Nazi of Nanking than to grapple with what his existence means about human nature, about moral complexity, about the choices we make when confronted with absolute evil. But forgetting him means forgetting the 250,000 people who survived because he refused to look away. Rabe's story also exposes how easily atrocities are erased from historical memory when they're politically inconvenient. The Nanking Massacre was one of the worst single atrocities of World War II, comparable in scale to some of the worst Nazi crimes. Yet it remains far less known in the West than events like the Holocaust or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Why? Because remembering it complicates Cold War alliances, because it challenges Western-centric narratives of the war, because the victims were Asian and the perpetrators were American allies in the post-war order. Rabe's diary survived by accident, hidden in archives. Rediscovered by chance, published only after the geopolitical reasons for suppressing it had faded. How many other stories are still buried? How many other witnesses were silenced? How much of history is missing because it was too complicated, too uncomfortable, too inconvenient for the people in power? Rabe's story is a reminder that historical truth is fragile, that it requires active effort to preserve, and that forgetting is often a deliberate choice rather than an accident. The legacy of the safety zone extends beyond Rabe himself. The International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone became a model for civilian protection efforts in later conflicts. The concept of creating neutral zones, of using international presence to deter atrocities, was replicated in other wars, with varying degrees of success. The documentation methods Rabe pioneered, the meticulous daily recording of atrocities for future accountability, became standard practice for human rights organizations. His diary is now studied in courses on international law, genocide studies, and human rights documentation. The physical site of his former residence in Nanjing is a museum and memorial visited by hundreds of thousands of people annually, a place where Chinese students learn about the massacre and about the foreigner who tried to stop it. His grave in Berlin has become a pilgrimage site for Chinese tourists who leave flowers and handwritten notes thanking him decades after his death. He saved people he never met, and he's being thanked by generations who never knew him. But perhaps the most important lesson from Rabe's story is about individual agency in the face of systemic evil. He was one person. He had no army, no official authority, no resources beyond a flag and his willingness to use it. He was operating within a genocidal system, both the Japanese occupation of Nanking and the Nazi regime he represented, yet he chose differently. He could have evacuated with the other foreigners. He could have followed orders from Berlin to stay neutral. He could have protected only German nationals and ignored the Chinese refugees. Every single day he had opportunities to save himself, to minimize his risk, to do less. And every single day he chose to do more. That choice didn't make him less of a Nazi. It didn't erase his complicity in a monstrous regime. But it did save 250,000 lives. The two truths coexist, and neither cancels the other. We don't have to redeem Rabe, to acknowledge what he did. We don't have to condemn him to recognize what he was. The story of the good Nazi of Nanking isn't a feel-good tale of redemption. It's a brutal reminder that history is messy, that people contain contradictions, that heroism and complicity can exist in the same person, and that sometimes the only thing standing between survival and annihilation is one stubborn individual who refuses to accept that there's nothing they can do. John Rabe wore a swastika armband and saved 250,000 people. That sentence should be impossible, but it's true. And the fact that we tried to forget it, that his story was buried for half a century, tells you everything you need to know about how uncomfortable we are with moral complexity. But discomfort isn't a reason to look away. It's a reason to look closer. Because the truth, no matter how complicated, is always worth remembering. And the people John Rabe saved deserve to have their survival acknowledged, even if the man who saved them makes us deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. That's the legacy. That's the story. That's the truth they didn't want you to know. They didn't.